September 19th, 2021. Episode 17, Worth Its Weight in Platinum. 6th day of Elysia's. Weather forecast, low 70s, light cloud cover. After the ambush, I made sure to check our surroundings thoroughly, paranoid that there might be other monsters lurking nearby. Thankfully, there seemed to be no sign of any, and we collected another 20 feet of rope from the dead. They also left behind several necklaces made of teeth. Kyokiojo dragged the creature's remains into the river, while the rest of us searched the area for the suspected hideout. Using his flight, Hyapan was able to find a carved-out enclave behind the falls. Inside, we discovered a series of glyphs on a stone wall. Moose was able to discern the glyphs as being draconic, though she didn't describe them as being written words, but more so as symbols representing different ideas. One of frost, another of flame, lightning, acid, and finally poison, in that order from the top going down. A clear representation of the chromatic dragons. We pondered if the intention was for us to use spells on the glyphs with the described effect. After a few failed attempts at this, Sven stepped up to the glyphs and simply touched them, his hand causing a white glow. Once he did this in the correct sequence, the glyphs took on a gold glow and an indent appeared in the stone wall. A door slid open in front of us. We made our way through the entry and found ourselves in a cool, damp, man-made cave. The room was about 8 feet tall and well lit due to some enchanted lanterns. Once we had all passed through the threshold of the door, it slid shut behind us, revealing a carving of Tiamat on the back. A good indicator that we were in the right place, but bad in the way that it confirmed the sort we might be dealing with. The area we stood in was littered with random gear designed for enduring the outdoors. Across the way was a portcullis that Moose ran up to eagerly. She explained, seeing a very small nondescript room with the exception of 6 blank statues, set in 2 rows of 3, imagine one corner of a chessboard. There was also another door inside. Trying hard to ignore the unease I felt about that room, I suggested we move down a nearby hallway instead, since we couldn't seem to open the portcullis yet. We carried on down the narrow hallway with an air of caution, before coming across 2 identical doors, one on the far wall and another to the left. Sven kicked the one straight ahead of us, faltering on his foot and only managing to cause it to rattle. He then tried the suggested handle and the door opened right up. The room it led to was a small library. There was a desk in the middle and a noticeable lever sticking out from the northern wall. Most of us ventured inside, but Kyokiojo and Thane couldn't have been less interested in exploring the new room even if it could speak for itself. Me, however, the den of my enemy is still a den and, well, the same goes for libraries, so I'm always inclined to be curious about what I could find in one. The overarching hope being that I could learn something more about what this lair was for, or what this group was up to. The desk was littered with not only books, but many handwritten journals and notes. Kyrax and I both noticed that many of the tomes pulled out revolved around Kelemvor, Lord of the Dead. I made a comment to her about how the Kelemvor books seemed out of place here, as though they did not belong to this library. She agreed and pointed out a number of books written in common, all involving necromancy. My eyes widened at this observation. I continued to pore over various book covers, before finally moving to the shelves. Nothing alarming about that, I remember thinking, before noticing the next most common subject of the small library. Dragons. Lots and lots of lore on dragons. Of course. I had pulled out a rather mundane-looking book to glance at its cover when I heard Moose ask, "What language is this?" Here, she was sitting on the floor with a large open book over her lap, and it was written in a strange script. I peeked over her shoulder and I recognized the language as Infernal. But, since it isn't something I actually know how to read, I casted Comprehend Languages and kneeled beside my friend to take a look. We learned that the tome Moose had found was a lore book about Avernus, the first of the 9 layers of hell. The book was full of drawings of fiends and devils. At the centerfold of it was Zael, Angel of the 7 Heavens and Archduchess of Avernus. The 7 Heavens is another name for Mount Celestia, a plane of existence that is generally part of the afterlife. I couldn't really grasp at first why such a book might be in this place, but then something occurred to me, about Tiamat. But then my thoughts were interrupted by Sven, bellowing out a, "Hey!" Everyone looked up to him, and he was holding a purple book he had pulled out from one of the shelves. A book that far stood out from the rest of the rather worn and plain-looking bunch. "What's this?" he demanded, shaking it in the air. I stood back up, and said a bit impatiently, "I'll admit. I mean, it would be a lot easier to find out if you forked it over, or could read some of it to us." Kyrax had stepped up beside him, as did I. Sven pointed out the cover to us. There was a golden and rather regal-looking unicorn profile on it. I offered to take the book to read it, and he handed it over to me. "Law of LaRue, by Eckermain Truesilver," I read out loud to everyone. The party gathered around as I opened the book. The first page was blank, but before I could move on to the next, words began to appear as though some invisible hand was writing them, very quickly I might add. The words began with 374 Dr. Heart of the Forest. The book illustrated an image as it continued to go on, before stopping to instruct us to turn the page in order to learn more. Kyrax, now completely engaged, took the book from my hands and took a seat with it, before turning the page. The gold casing around the book's spine was beginning to emit a light, and then, we were just pulled into the book itself. Maybe some kind of teleportation magic, transmutation magic. I don't know. I hadn't been ready or thought to try and see. All I know is we were no longer standing in that dingy library, but instead the end of a meadow that merged into a vast forest. The sun was setting behind some mountains in the distance, and we could hear the narrator describing the very same scene we could see before us. I looked down at myself and then at my comrades. We were still ourselves. Not sure why, I half expected that to change, seeing as we were now being pulled into some kind of story. It didn't come across as simply text in a book when I could literally feel the brisk air on my face, as though we truly were back outside the cave. Behind us, there was a swirling gold portal, the one we had been pulled through. Kyrax was looking around a bit excitedly. "This is the High Forest," she exclaimed as we took in our new surroundings. From there, we sort of haphazardly walked on a little, unsure of what to do next except for follow the narration. Night fell upon us fast and the moon rose up to the sky, making it fairly dark where we were. From the forest we spotted 3 drunken satyrs making their way into the meadow's clearing. They noticed us, and shambled on over, speaking another familiar language, Sylvan. The one introduced himself as Tragos and spoke about how they had been out for a revel, when they were attacked by wild-eyed ravens. They were asking for help, wanting to be escorted home as they couldn't fight well themselves after getting injured. Thane asked them in Sylvan where their home was. "Polvarth Plateau," Tragos answered, though they seemed unsure of exactly how far they had wandered from it. They said they knew it was to the north, and that it would likely only take about a few hours by hoof. Thane cocked his head as though thinking carefully about his answer. "I'm not sure we have time for such a detour right now." It was just as he uttered this sentence that the satyrs completely froze in place. Almost as though they had been put under some kind of spell. I looked around, but there was nobody I could see casting nearby. None of us seemed sure of what was going on, but it wasn't just the satyrs that had stopped all movement, but the world itself. The breeze was now gone. On second thought, Thane began, and with those 3 simple words, life returned with no acknowledgement from anyone outside our party. This was so peculiar. To the point where naturally, it became a page force experiment. Thane would start by saying we couldn't assist the satyrs with their dilemma, and the world would pause as though it couldn't go on if we didn't follow this thread or plot line. And then, he would mention changing his mind and the world would reanimate, as though second-guessing his decision hadn't even happened. The story clearly depended on us, but we didn't have time right then. We were still inside of an enemy's secret cave, in midst of trying to find out what they were up to. With some mixed feelings about the situation, we decided to leave back out the portal we came in from. There was another bright flash of light after passing through, and we immediately found ourselves back in the small library. The book was still sitting on the table where Kyrax had set it down. I gently closed the book, picked it up and offered it back to her. Keep it safe, and we will revisit this another time. Kyrax nodded in agreement, stashing the purple book away somewhere on her person. At this point Kyokyojo was done with our little library visit, as well as the strange magical book distraction. He was already walking away from the rest of us, before Kyrax and I had finished our exchange. Kyrax was quick to follow after him, not wanting him to wander off alone. He made his way just out the door to the library, and turned towards the only other door in that hallway that we hadn't yet tried. He turned the handle quickly. A triggering sound reached all of our ears. Darts were whizzing out of the now open doorway. Both Kyokyojo and Kyrax were in the line of fire. The rest of us scrambled on over to the hallway after hearing a loud thud. Kyrax's statuesque form had crumbled to the floor. Svend was able to reach her body and drag her back into the library, out of the path of more darts. Kyokyojo reappeared, ripping one of the darts out of his shoulder and inspecting the dripping end of it before tossing it aside in frustration. He informed us that they were indeed poisonous. He then tore the potion bottle free from his side, and quickly administered it to the passed-out Kyrax, after pulling 2 darts off of her as well. As Kyrax began to come to, we once again realized that we must proceed through this place with more caution. Kyrax awoke with a bit of a seething breath coming out through her teeth. She was clutching her side. Apparently a more serious injury had occurred than any of us could have been aware of, forcing her to then use her own healing hands to rid herself of it. After a short moment of recovery, Kyokyojo once more set his sights on the hallway. As he made his way closer, we could all hear the firing sounds of more darts. Kyokyojo laid down to avoid them. Moose also made her way towards the open doorway, crawling to avoid the darts as well. She chanced a look at the open room that the darts were coming from. She also listened carefully for the mechanism's sound when they fired. She pointed to the holes and then the floor, letting Kyokyojo know that the darts were triggered once he reached a certain range, but that the mechanism could only store so many. Once it was out of darts, we would be safe from the trap. Hearing this made Kyokyojo stay in his spot on the ground, so the trap would stay triggered until the darts stopped shooting. Once it seemed safe, he stood up and collected them all. He now had a handful of poisonous darts at his disposal. The rest of that room contained nothing else but the trap. It was just a dead end, and now that we had figured that much out, there was really only one more obvious thing to try in order to keep going in this place. Moose made her way to the lever we had noticed earlier in the library. I went to follow her, but she motioned for me to stay back. She told all of us to stay away as she reached for the lever, pulling it down in one fluid motion. We all heard a distinct thunk, followed by the sound of chains. Moose made a break for the hallway, running past all of us, and cheering that the portcullis was now open. I called for her to slow down, as we all followed. Moose only slowed down once she stepped inside the small room with the statues. The rest of us were filing in, one at a time from down the narrow hallway. I distinctly remember hearing her gasp, followed by an odd announcement. "It's me." And sure enough, upon arriving in that room, I saw Moose face to face with a completely dark version of herself. Luckily, as Dark Moose made the first move to attack, Svend had managed to get right beside our Moose and was able to defend her. He looked up, and I followed his gaze. All of the statues had come to life, and each one of them looked like one of us. My eyes settled on the one that I recognized as being me. What the hell is this? I questioned internally. I looked over her, wondering if she would have the exact same spells as I do, but I didn't get to find out. Svend was jumping his way into my view, violently cutting down the dark Siluca with his katana. He then turned on the one that looked like Thane, slashing that doppelganger as well. I let out a breath, nodding my head. I don't know how I should feel right now. Looking back on it, I mean, did he have to do it with such gusto? Not that it really matters, but a fight where you have to slay beings that look like your friends? I mean, who would be prepared for that? I thought maybe someone such as Thane would be, as I watched him perform a critical sword strike on the doppelganger of Kyokyojo, bringing it down, only to turn towards the Dark Moose and suddenly hesitate. The words, No, it isn't real. Escaping his lips. Not a sentiment dark Thane shared, as it slashed at Sven twice, hitting him both times with its short sword. Moose had now begun battling herself, as was Kyrax. I assisted Moose, while Thane managed to get over his doubts, allowing him to cut down the doppelganger of Sven, before he too took on himself and defeated his lookalike as well. Kyokyojo finally slashed down the doppelganger of Moose, leaving only Kyrax for all of us to focus on. Thane finally managed to catch the killing blow with a decisive and powerful sword attack from behind. Now with all of the lookalikes slain, we took a moment to catch our breath, gathering our wits to travel through the door at the opposite end of this room. This next area was set up as a shrine dedicated to Tiamat, but that wasn't what was immediately noticeable. Below our feet was a trail of blood that led from where we stood to a glowing door to the south with glyphs on it. Ahead of us was a red granite statue of Tiamat, each one of her 5 heads looking regal and judgmental as they stared vacantly in our direction. There was a black gem in the center head's mouth. In front of this shrine were 4 rows of pews facing the statue. Once we moved closer, we noticed the pew in the front was lined with purple felt, while the others had been red and full of bloody handprints. We examined the gem inside the dragon's mouth. Nothing about it seemed integral, but the other 4 dragons' mouths were closed. Kyokyojo took notice of another room to the north. He peeked inside and mentioned that it was living quarters, but that they looked as though they had already been cleared out. We were able to identify the glyphs as a ward, meant to keep the door closed from the opposite side. Realizing we were not going to get through that way, we decided to cut through the living quarters to another very basic-looking door on the opposite end. This door turned out to be locked. Thane attempted to unlock it with his thieves' tools, but wasn't able to do it. Finally, Sven just kicked the door wide open. The smell of death filtered into our noses as we breached this new room. It was also far darker inside, as though some of the enchanted lanterns had been taken out. Kyokyojo casted dancing lights to help those who couldn't see well. Moose set out ahead of the rest of us. I followed closely behind, reminding her that we needed to be wary of traps. She nodded and we looked around a bit more cautiously first. There were a lot of sigils on the floor and a magic circle. 3 of the sigils had been scratched out violently, and there lay 3 dead cultists, their bodies covered in lacerations, blood soaking the floor. One was even missing an arm. I covered my nose and mouth for a moment, wincing at the sight as everyone else scattered into the room to look around. All of us were a bit on edge now. Other than the bodies, there was a rack of weapons and some shelves. Kyokyojo was walking by the rack. It contained several black-bladed scimitars. Thane was inspecting the shelves. They were full of spell components. I watched as he pocketed some silver wire and a small piece of amber. The far wall had a stone door. This door was slightly ajar. Kyrax was making her way towards that door as Moose and I examined the magic circle. Moose recognized it as a teleportation circle. It looked to be about 5 feet in diameter and we both knew other magic would be required to get it to activate. We heard a shuffling behind us, and looked up to see Kyrax stumbling back away from the open stone door. Her face was surprisingly pale. "Kyrax, what's wrong?" She pointed. Her body was trembling a bit and she just let out a single breathless "No." Sven looked to Kyrax, and then to the door, moving towards it without hesitation. I turned back towards the teleportation circle, trying to look for any signs to show if it had been used recently or not, fearing it could cause us a problem if it had been. "Looks as though it's been deactivated for at least a week or longer," I thought, but then came Sven's voice. "It's a dragon, a decrepit one." I stood up, making my way into the room Sven had just charged into. "Wait, what? Is it undead?" I could see Kyrax nodding in response to my question just as I turned towards the hall, and met 2 lifeless, black eyes staring at me. I froze up, like the satyrs had. But the world hadn't paused. No, this was fear welling up inside of me while locked in this creature's gaze. "Oh, I've felt this before." I thought back to those demon-like dog creatures we had faced in the high moor. The ones with the black voids for eyes. The only sound I could hear was my own heart beating, as that same chill moved over me and then through. And then, just as quickly as it came, it passed, and my nerve had returned. I swallowed before taking in the scene. The floor of this room was made of red granite. The very same as the Tiamat statue we had seen in the shrine room. There was also another giant magic circle carved into the granite, along with several more glyphs full of gouges. Two corners of the wall had tapestries depicting a battle of giants versus dragons. And in the middle was a hoard of treasure, where this horrid creature lay. A being that had once been a white dragon, now reduced to a mere skeletal beast with bits of flesh hanging from certain parts of its bones. I glanced away from it, not wishing to look at how hideous it was. My eyes were moving to the magic circles below it. A rare transmutation and necromancy circle, something I have never seen. I say this out loud so everyone will know. This creature was created, and we would need to end it. Sven responded first by pointing at it. "You're not supposed to be here," he shouted. The skeletal beast growled in an attempt to meet his aggression. And then it stood up, to its full adult dragon height. And thus the fight started, as Sven flew towards it with his katana out. Fighting something like that, it doesn't just leave you. That creature was haunting in more ways than one. As we continued to throw a barrage of page force attacks at it, all while trying not to get killed by tail swipes and claws alike, something was beginning to happen. The creature was changing. Its rage seemed to be swaying into something more like pain and sadness. Though, these clearly pained expressions wouldn't last. Upon the next attack from someone's sword or spell, the monster's face would change, as though the madness was taking hold of it once more. It would then become especially ferocious in its attacks, but it was also clearly growing weak. And then Kyrax, she saw it. The origin of this poor creature's current existence. The once dragon, in all of its poor misery, shared with her images from its mind. She later described to us how this white dragon had been brought to this place in shackles, and made to drink a concoction. How she had seen the black gem in the Tiamat statue's mouth turn white, and then all of the scales and skin had fallen off of the dragon, before a blinding white light then hit it. Coming out of that vision, Kyrax met the white pinpoint eyes of the beast, and she noted that they were signaling to her. Signaling towards the door to the north. Kyrax then shouted, letting us all know. "The gem. We need to get to it." Kyokyojo answered, saying he would make his way there. The rest of us continued to fight, as Kyokyojo backtracked his way through the previous rooms. He arrived back in the shrine room and then pulled the gem free from Tiamat's mouth. It was glowing a bright white now, just as Kyrax had seen in her vision. Meanwhile, Sven had landed a critical blow over the dragon, causing its body to collapse as though defeated. We stood around watching in question, wondering if it was about to get back up. And then, Kyokyojo reappeared in the room. "The dragon is a lich and the phylactery needs to be destroyed," Kyrax declared. She marched her way towards him. We all watched as Kyrax held up her holy symbol, her sword was lighting up. Kyokyojo threw the gem and Kyrax's blade crashed into it, shattering it to dust.